couple of other things that I'll cover, and this slide involves something that I try to stress to everybody. Compromised blood vessels and reduced blood flow to the brain due to coronary artery disease can cause the death of brain cells and tissues. And what causes that? One of the big causes is a diet that is really rich in animal foods and fat. Too much protein, too much fat, too much animal food. We've always recommended that people dial that back a lot. And then high iron intake is linked to both Parkinson's disease and compromised blood vessels, atherosclerosis. The most absorbable form of iron is heme iron, which is found in meat. And so I said before, this is a point that I like to make, is that diet has such a breadth of effect. Eat a bad diet, and there is no limit to the number of bad things that can happen to you. I mean, I hate to sound like a doomsday girl, but it's true. Change your diet, and it's astounding the number of different diseases you can prevent and the positive effect that you can have on almost any of the diseases that you have. There are obviously exceptions to the rule, but the rule pretty much is if you've got the misbehavior, if you want to call it that, I don't want to sound like a school marm here, but misbehavior in the diet and lifestyle areas will lead to sooner or later something going wrong. And the question is, how serious is it going to be, and how many things going wrong are you going to let happen, right? So some of the causes, genetics definitely plays a role, but as I said, a minor role. And by the way, just one thing that I don't think we talk about enough is that everybody got very excited when the genome was mapped, and people started looking at all of these different genetic mutations, hoping to find specific markers that would tell you what was going to happen to people. You're going to develop this disease or not develop this disease. And it was astounding how low the correlation was. And it doesn't mean that it's non-existent. It just means that you pretty much can overcome genetic predisposition. It works both ways, by the way, not just for Parkinson's, but for other conditions. In other words, you could have a terrible genetic profile. I actually do, by the way. I come from a family of women in my family who have had autoimmune disease for generations. Okay, so terrible genetic profile, but I've overcome it by taking care of myself. You can have a great genetic profile, and you can overcome that by not taking care of yourself. So it works both ways. Environmental toxins actually plays a pretty minor role unless you consider the environmental toxins that are in conventionally grown animal foods in our society. Prions, this is closely related to it, abnormal folding of proteins, which can cause brain and neurological damage. They can be acquired or due to genetic predisposition. Acquired is mad cow disease, which I'm sure you've heard of, passed from cows to humans through contaminated food. The human form of the disease is called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's considered rare, but sometimes I wonder how rare it really is when I see so many conditions with neurological disorders that would be characteristic of it. I wonder what the level or the incidence of misdiagnosis is. Oxidative stress, which most people experience a lot of based on their daily habits. Neurotransmitter imbalance, mitochondrial dysfunction, which can be due to a high-fat diet and inflammation. That also leads to diabetes, by the way, type 2 diabetes. Age-related decreased production of dopamine-producing cells. And the fact that it's age-related doesn't mean that it has to happen to you. In other words, we have this picture of aging in our culture that I think is so sad, where you reach a certain point and then you just degenerate for decades. And I have just not signed up for that program. I don't want to be part of that program. I intend to live until I die. And I get very inspired when I read these stories of people living to be 100, 105, 110 years old. And just one thing I want to point out to you about these people, and you can go online and read all day long these centenarians and their stories. There's a lot of very inspirational, but I have never read one that said, the reason I live to be 105 and why I'm still doing street races, I've covered this in one of my videos, by the way. A woman was entering street races when she was over 100 years old. They had to create a new age category for her. All right, so anyway, the reason why I've lived to this ripe old age is thank God for the doctors in my life. I really was diligent about doctor visits and making sure I hung out with lots of doctors all the time, and I owe my great health to them. Not one of them has ever said that. It's their diet, it's exercise, it's staying socially active, all that sort of thing. So this whole business of falling apart as you age, it just felt like I needed to make those comments here. Inflammation, increased rate of cell death, abnormal response to dopamine in the brain, and a high intake of iron, which I mentioned before, but bears mentioning again, and it's coming from animal food. Medications like tranquilizers and drugs used to treat gastroparesis or slow-moving digestive system in diabetics can cause Parkinson's-like syndrome symptoms. And I mentioned before, constipation can be the canary in the coal mine. Constipation is the canary in the coal mine, not necessarily specific to Parkinson's, but specific to everything else you don't want to have happen. It increases your risk of colon cancer. It increases your risk of everything, including damage to the microbiome, which is really sort of the thermostat for your immune system. So taking care of your gastrointestinal tract is a key to maintaining health, protecting yourself against all conditions. Exposure to pesticides may be a factor in genetically susceptible people. Some people do not detoxify things very well. And concentrations of deldrin, which is an insecticide compounds in the substantia nigra, are higher in PD patients. But even that is somewhat controllable by keeping your body in good shape. We have an amazing capacity to detoxify all kinds of things if we're doing everything right. Most of the chemical intake actually is from food: meat, chicken, eggs, fish, and dairy. Dairy is a special category, which I'm going to cover. I have a couple slides about dairy specifically. If you are going to eat animal foods, and I've never drawn that line in the sand that says that if you eat any, you're not going to be able to be healthy, because I don't think it's true. I don't consume them, for the record, but if you're going to choose to eat animal food, eating a small amount, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, make sure it's organic or wild caught, because if you really do some research on the way that conventionally grown animals and fish, farm fish are grown, you would never consume this stuff. It's absolutely gross. The highest incidence of Parkinson's disease is in Europe and North America. And as I said at the very beginning, rural Africans, Chinese, and Japanese you don't see any Parkinson's disease in Okinawa. And in these places, there is a much greater focus on plant-based eating. Milk consumption. I said dairy was a special category here. It usually is in most disease processes, actually. But milk consumption in middle age is associated with a higher risk of Parkinson's disease. Men who consume more than 2 glasses of milk a day, or the equivalent, have 2 times the incidence of Parkinson's disease as men who do not consume cow's milk. And by the way, added incentive, if you're a guy, not only do you not want to get Parkinson's disease, but there is a huge connection between, well proven, between consuming dairy products and prostate cancer as well. The highest consumers of milk have twice the risk of Parkinson's. 4 prospective studies have shown an association between eating dairy products and a higher risk of developing PDs, particularly in men. The increased risk for people eating dairy ranges from a low of 10% to as much as 230% in some studies. And the greatest risk is that category of people who consume 16 ounces of dairy or more per day versus those who consume no dairy. And again, there may be some molecular mimicry involved, because dairy is a huge trigger based on molecular mimicry for type 1 diabetes. According to a meta-analysis of studies, dairy intake resulted in a 60% increased risk of developing PD in men and women combined, 80% greater risk in men, 30% higher risk in women consuming the most dairy compared with those who consume the least. And one of the reasons why this is important is that when you see a dose-dependent effect, like the incidence of Parkinson's in this case increasing as dairy increases, the dose-dependent effect is some added information it gives you more justification in saying there's likely a connection. I mentioned weight. Weight is a factor for everything, a risk factor for everything. Overweight in midlife is identified as a risk factor. People with a BMI of 30, twice the risk of PD versus those with a BMI of less than 23.5. And inflammation is the risk. That's why you see such a connection between obesity and overweight and all diseases, including cancer, is that your fat cells are very busy pumping out inflammatory cytokines and inflammatory chemicals that raise inflammation levels in general and put you at risk of many, many things. And by the way, that's where genetics comes in. If you take a look, and let's say we line up 20 people, and we have them eat the same terrible diet starting at the same age. Sooner or later, something will go wrong with these people. The age of onset will have something to do with genetics, and also the flavor of disease. So one person does all the wrong things and ends up with cancer, another one has a heart attack, somebody else becomes diabetic, somebody else develops an autoimmune disease. It's all related to the habits and the weight that results from those habits.